of Advent and our third week of our homily series, From the Heart of Jesus. This Advent, I've invited us to reflect on Pope Francis's encyclical Dilexit Nos, which is our Latin for He Loved Us. The encyclical is an invitation to share more deeply this Advent season in the love that flows from the Sacred Heart of Jesus. In our first week, we looked at the need we have to not let our hearts become drowsy, to wake up, if you will, our hearts so that they can encounter God's love beyond the tinsel and the trees. Last Sunday, we reflected on how God reshapes not only the earth, but also reshapes our own hearts so that we can prepare for his coming in such a way that makes our hearts ready to rejoice. And today on Gaudete Sunday, that's the command that we're given. Rejoice in the Lord always, St. Paul says. I shall say it again, rejoice. But as much as we might be eager to rejoice, close enough to Christmas to be hearing joy to the world in our heads, the Church reminds us that we are still in a season of preparation, and it is God who has worked still in us, making our hearts ready for Christ's coming. Our first two readings today beckon us to rejoice. The gospel, however, is a little bit different. It issues us a challenge. The crowds gather around John the Baptist and they ask the question, what then should we do? In essence, they're saying, if we follow this new way of life that you're proposing, if we follow this new Messiah whose way you're preparing, what does that mean for us in our lives? And I don't think John's answer would have comforted those people. It would not have given them a sense of peace. No, he really challenged them, and he challenges us to a radical way of life. If you have more than you need, give it away. Whoever has 2 cloaks should share with the one who has none, and do the same with your food. This passage always reminds me of the African cardinal who spoke at an American parish about the importance of sharing what we have with others. And at the end of the talk, they did a little question and answer, and a lady raised her hand and she said, Cardinal, it sounds like in your talk that you're saying it's a sin to own 2 pairs of shoes. And the cardinal gave a knowing laugh and a smile and then responded, it's not a sin to own 2 pairs of shoes until you meet someone who has none. Those words to me are not comforting words, but words of deep challenge, calling me to look at my possessions and ask the questions, are they enough? Are they too much? Am I sharing in the right proportion to what has been entrusted to me? Tax collectors, whose own wealth was based on the revenue brought in, John told them they should collect only what is prescribed. In other words, don't finagle the books so you can make a little more money. And the soldiers, who could extort others under the threat of force, should not do so. And he adds that they should be satisfied with their wages. I think when we hear these words, we think John is simply telling them to be good people. But I think John is challenging them to much more, challenging them and us to a radical way of living. So I think it's worthwhile, a little bit more than halfway through the Advent season, to spend some time thinking about why John's summons to generosity and justice are so moving for those people that they lead those people to question in their hearts whether or not John himself is the Messiah. As we've been looking at Dilexit Nos, there is a key in it to help us understand how we recognize Jesus through this call to generosity and justice. The second chapter of the encyclical starts off with these words, the heart of Christ, as the symbol of the deepest and most personal source of his love for us, is the very core of the initial preaching of the gospel. It stands at the origin of our faith as the wellspring that refreshes and enlivens our Christian beliefs. And then the rest of the second chapter of this encyclical goes through the passages in the gospel that reveal Jesus' great love for us. And it's almost as if Pope Francis is taking us on a little mini retreat. As Pope Francis writes, by examining Jesus' interactions with others, we can come to realize how he treats each and every one of us. And what is revealed is this: a Jesus who seeks people out and approaches them. He doesn't wait for them to come to him. He goes out to them. A Jesus who heals people, not from a distance, but in close proximity, touching them and showing them the depths of his love. What is revealed is a Jesus who draws near to us in our fears and tells us over and over again, do not be afraid. What is revealed is a Jesus who looks at us and loves us and calls us to forsake everything and follow him. A Jesus who had compassion for the crowds around him and then fed them himself. A Jesus who was moved with grief and compassion. But above all, what is revealed to us is a Jesus who loves us. This is the one who is mightier than I, who is coming, the one who loves us. And when we have that authentic understanding, that authentic experience of Jesus, we are like the disciples on the road to Emmaus. You might remember this story. We usually hear it during the Easter season. It occurred on that very first Easter Sunday, the day of the resurrection, but before the news of the resurrection had reached all of the disciples. And two of the disciples were leaving Jerusalem. They had given up. Jesus was dead, he was buried, and obviously he was not the Messiah, because the Messiah could not be killed. And so they were going home to pick up the pieces of their shattered dreams. And suddenly this stranger starts walking with them, and he asks them, what are you talking about? And they look at him confused and say, do you not know what's been going on about this Jesus who died and was buried, and how we thought he was going to be the Messiah, how we thought he was going to be the one to save Israel? And so they start sharing that with him. And then Jesus says, although he doesn't say it quite like this, he says, you're stupid. He said, didn't he tell you that all these things were going to happen? Didn't he tell you that he had to die so as to be raised? And then they go into their home and he breaks bread with them. And when he breaks bread with them, they recognize him, and then he vanishes from their sight. And that's when they say this: were not our hearts burning within us as he spoke to us on the road and opened the scriptures for us? Our hearts too burn in the presence of Jesus because we long for that authentic kind of love. Our hearts are moved to generosity when we recognize the one who has already been so very generous with us. Only real love can call us to such profound generosity and justice. Only a heart that is rooted in that love, the heart of Jesus, can root our hearts in that same transforming love. The good news that John the Baptist announces is that this love is not a hypothetical love. It's not just an ideal that can be glimpsed but never directly encountered. Instead, this love is coming, John tells us, to dwell with us, making his home among us. This love is the love of the Sacred Heart of Jesus in our midst. As our first reading promised today, then will we be glad and exult with all our heart. The love that St. Paul talks about in our second reading when he writes that the peace of God that surpasses all understanding will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Our hearts will find peace. Our hearts will find joy in the heart of Jesus Christ, who loves us beyond measure. And that is reason not only to rejoice once, but to say again, rejoice.